We're joined in studio by Tshepo Kgadima, energy expert. Good to have you, Tshepo. Good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us. You'd always raise the concern about the ever-escalating debt around state-owned entities and their need, whenever they have to recapitalize, to have to go back to those funders, that it is unsustainable. Are we seeing the results thereof now, where Eskom essentially is stuck? The financial results are even delayed at that matter. What in your view, is the latest development in that scenario?
Well, this is a case of the chickens coming home to roost. The chickens coming home to roost in terms of the delay of the interim financials. We have to bear in mind that the financial year end of Eskom is 31 March. So ordinarily then after 6 months they would have produced the interim results. And the JSE, because the bonds that Eskom has issued to various investors, those bonds are in turn traded on the bond exchange of the JSE. So as a requirement in terms of all bond issuers, they have to be issuing their financials over a period of time so that those investors can have a see-through and a clear understanding of the risks involved in the underlying asset which the bond is predicated on. So we shouldn't be surprised that the directive by the JSE to say failure to issue the interim financial statement will result or carries the risk of the suspension of the bond. Now, what will that eventuate in? In the event that the bond is suspended from trading on the JSE, it just simply means that Eskom going forward will not be able to continue. The board of Eskom in the year ended 31 March 2017, in that financial year, they took a decision to, between 2017 and 2022, I think, to raise over 338 billion rand through various bond issuances in the market in order to finance the build program. Now, if the bond is suspended, it simply means that door is closed. Therefore, everything else that they had predicated funding of the new build program, of particularly the two key power stations they're building, would come to a grinding halt. So that is I think the clear and present risk that Eskom is facing. But why is Eskom delaying in terms of issuance of its financial services? It tells us probably one or two things. First and foremost, we can see that in terms of the interference, the increased and unprecedented interference we saw coming both either from the African National Congress, from the Democratic Alliance, from Parliament as a whole, that brought about instability in terms of the management of Eskom. We also know that Eskom, where it is now in terms of its chief financial officer, they don't even have a treasury department. They used to have a treasury department. Now, they don't have that. That was killed. I think, I forget his first name, but the surname is Maleka. For a long time, he was the treasurer at Eskom, and Eskom cannot do without a treasurer. Now, they don't have a treasurer. On the other hand, they don't have a chief financial officer. The one they have is an acting one. That instability most certainly, I think, has precipitated this chain of events, including, of course, the inability to prepare financial statement. Also, it could be telling us another thing, that the financial situation has gotten precariously worse than what was highlighted in the financial report of the year ended 31 March 2017, that in the interim period of the 6 months, things got so worse that right now probably the going concern status would be a non-going issue. Now, there are a number of things I can reflect on as to what are some of the key factors that could have led to Eskom now finding itself in this position whereby following the previous financial year, full year, they had good financial performance, and now all of a sudden, within a 6-month period, the situation could have gotten this precariously worse.
And the remedies around that in finding different revenue sources, besides, of course, the rates that you and I pay and companies, etc., for the commodity. What is in store, especially for Finance Minister and Public Enterprises Minister, in dealing with how state-owned entities manage their affairs and get back into a healthier financial state?
Look, for a long time I have commented, and sadly and tragically, the government refuses to listen to wise counsel. And I have commented that unless you reform company law when it comes to state-owned companies, and more specifically address on how they raise capital. I mean, even today, the minister is still talking, we need to look at a funding model. Actually, there is no other way. Right now, what we know is this. All of the state-owned companies, they only have got one source of funding, and that funding is through debt. Now, it is absurd and very weird that no other utility anywhere else in the world has followed the funding model which has been imposed upon Eskom or a Transnet or any of the other state-owned companies. And for whatever reason, I don't know what it is because it has not been explained, they believe that this can continue. Well, it cannot continue, that we know for sure. So the question that has to be asked is that, could there perhaps be a sinister motive by those that are in government from refusing to amend and reform company law when it comes to state-owned companies and specifically on how they are funded? Could there be a sinister motive to actually bring about their bankruptcy so that they're then given to what I always term the greedy privateering, profiteering privateers?
So are you saying, just to make me understand, that you're saying that they state-owned by name only because whoever owes or you owe money to owns you, because you know they have terms and conditions as to when you can pay, when you can continue business. We saw even with the banks now being reluctant, some refusing to fund Eskom unless they meet certain conditions prescribed by the banks, which tend to be even harsher and increase their loan base.
Well, they've designed it so that banks who are themselves politicians to start imposing conditions that have got nothing to do with the finances or with financial performance, with operational viability of the enterprise, that they want to have a much more greater say on who should be running Eskom and running it in a manner that they choose. So effectively here we've got privatization by stealth. The question is, does this government have the gumption to be able to realize that that is not a sustainable situation? If anything, it will bring a very painful, untimely death of this very important state utility. We must bear this in mind. In terms of the financial report of Eskom for the year ended 31 March 2017, it means that in that time period, Eskom's daily turnover was 485 million rand a day. So that is the figures that we are talking about. And hence I'm saying I cannot imagine for the life of me, how can a company that turns over 485 million rand a day not have an army in the Treasury Department that works out ways and means of what to do with that daily cash flow? On the other hand, of course, instability that has been induced by the politicians who lack understanding of this very important and yet complex company that have themselves been interfering, been giving unlawful instructions, and that has been allowed to the extent where now we are sitting with, we say, well, this company might even come to an end. Now, what are some of the things that we know? In terms of the financial report that I'm referring to for the year ended 31 March 2017, page 5 of that report, it is astonishing that all of the people who have made it their business to interfere in the operations of Eskom, they seem not to have ever read page 5, where management in that annual report clearly articulated some of the things, some of the key things. What do we know? Of the 177 billion rand turnover for that year, 82 billion rand was what they term primary energy cost, meaning to generate a kilowatt of electricity or a gigawatt hour of electricity so that to power this economy. Now, of that 82 billion rand, what else do we know? We now find that over 19 billion rand, I think it's about 19.9 billion rand of the 82 billion rand was actually expended on independent power producers. Now, on that page 5, the management clearly articulates this as a clear and present risk which government must be aware of. Why must government be aware of? Because we know that the African National Congress, the chair of the portfolio committee, the ministers that have been there, whether it was Tina Jumat Peterson, Mamuloko Gubai, or even Minister Matlowo now, all of them, inexplicably, they still continue with this bizarre demand that Eskom must sign further power purchase agreements with independent power producers. Now, you work out the math. You say the 19.9 billion rand that was given to these independent power producers at an average cost of 2.09 rand per kilowatt hour. You ask, what is Eskom selling that 2 kilowatt hour which they purchase for 2.09 rand for? What do they sell it for? They sell it for way below 1 rand per kilowatt hour. The math doesn't make sense. So you got this 19 billion rand that was given to these privateers, and now the government demands, in the face of Eskom facing this exceedingly hard financial times because of, among other things, of the role of the independent power producers, they are demanding that further power purchase agreements must be signed, because the banks, the very same banks that are now refusing to advance further credit to Eskom, are exactly the same banks that have overinvested without any commercial reason whatsoever in the independent power producer program, and therefore demanding from
but
the
what
state
you're talking about is
the
leadership, and it seems like the mold has been set. There's been these kind of mutually beneficial relationship going on, be it the financiers or government officials, etc. That how then are you going to clean up this mess if there are those who are thriving in this self-created chaos?
Well, perhaps maybe it's a time for civil society to approach this through the courts. That incestuous relationship between the government and the governing party, together with this greedy cartel of banks, has to come to an end. Because if it doesn't come to an end, we're all going to be dragged down. So I spoke about that is one of the key risks. By the way, the independent power producer program, in terms of the 3,100 megawatts that has been contracted over a 15 to 20 year period, the price tag is 700 billion rand, which in turn means on average a year, Eskom will be paying 35 billion rand. It will increase from 19 to 35 billion rand. If they sign further, the price tag there also, even though they're saying the cost per kilowatt hour will be lesser, we are looking at another 700 billion rand. Now, how many gigawatt hours did Eskom sell in the year ended 2017 March? They sold over 214,000 gigawatt. How many gigawatts were procured from the independent power producers at 19.9 billion rand? It was only 11,000 gigawatt. Now, there is the chief of the financial woes we are seeing Eskom facing, to the extent that now its sustainability or its going concern status is now in question.
Yeah, but I mean, we also have the Johannesburg Stock Exchange threatening suspension of the securities of Eskom if they don't release the interim results. But you've just spoken about a relationship with the banks having overinvested. So there is a lot of stake throughout the value chain of Eskom, not just in terms of those, the bond purchases.
Well, there is a lot at stake. Now, it's always been my assertion that in the event that government is stopped from unlawfully demanding Eskom to sign the independent power producer power purchase agreements, most of the CEOs of these banks who then took the decision to invest in this exceedingly nonsensical electricity strategy in terms of the renewables independent power producers, most of those CEOs of those banks will lose their jobs, because there is absolutely no way that they can be able to justify it, but they have expended the money. So now what we are seeing a government that is far too timid, that is far too docile, instead of asserting itself and forget about the banks. Let the banks make provisions and write off whatever that they invested in the independent power producer program. The numbers no longer make sense. They never made sense from day one. But what we are seeing here is that when you hear that even the chair of the Portfolio Committee on Energy in Parliament just recently went and spoke to the management of Eskom and demanded that they sign the power purchase agreements, when you've got the Minister of Energy, Minister Matlobo, also wanting to issue what they call a Section 43(1) of the Energy Regulation Agency determination that Eskom must sign despite these exceedingly hard, difficult times for Eskom, you have to wonder and say, whose interests are they saving? Because if they are saving the interest of this country, if they are saving the interest of this economy, they would have seen the madness in some of this. One of the other challenges that comes with Eskom's ways, by the way, is this. They, from this year up till 2022, have a number of bonds that are maturing, and the total maturity value of those bonds by 2022 is well over 230 billion rand. So the question that must be asked is as well, where exactly is Eskom going to get the money to redeem those bonds as they are maturing against the backdrop of increased interest costs on the debt that they are now incurring for a new build program? No other utility anywhere in the world ever built large-scale, capitally intensive projects such as Eskom is doing now from debt, promise on the hope that they will get tariff increases without any question mark whatsoever, unless, of course, did correctly by
I mean, I think it's much more deeper than what we as consumers are concerned about in terms of keeping the lights on. But it's always an education being with you, Tshepo. It's something that we'll be watching very closely. Tshepo Kgadima is an energy expert joining us on Eskom's interim results are still being delayed, and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange threatening that this could lead to the suspension of their securities or their bonds.